Welcome to the Purple Sky Thinking for Leaders podcast. This podcast is for you if you lead people, teams, or the organisation. You might be a leader or a manager yourself, or you might be part of the support team to help those people to be really successful. I'm Anwen Bottois. I'm the leadership success coach and founder of Purple Sky Consulting, and I'm going to be the host for this podcast. My mission is to help as many leaders as possible to really love what they do. I want to help you to feel more confident, more capable, more effective, so that you can build and grow happy, healthy, more successful teams. This podcast is going to be all about helping you to love leading. Let's get started. Welcome to this episode of Purple Sky Thinking for Leaders. Really delighted to have you along for this episode. We are going to be talking to the fabulous Emma Lloyd from Create the Ripple. I am a huge fan of Emma, so I'm really delighted that she said yes to coming on to this podcast and this episode. So what we're going to be talking about today is that transition of leaders moving through different roles, some of the things to take account of and to think about if that is you as a leader, or something to have a think about in terms of supporting leaders who might go through that. So let's get right into it and head into this episode of the Purple Sky Thinking for Leaders podcast. Really happy to have you here today, Emma. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. So first thing we're going to do is ask you to do a little bit of an intro in terms of what you would like our listeners, our viewers to know about you and what you're doing now and why you do it.
Oh gosh, so I'm Emma and I created a company called Create the Ripple, and we are all about creating learning and development experiences. We work across industries and across the globe, and the key word there is the experiences that we create. So packed full with moments to pause, think, reflect, have some fun along the way. Predominantly quite a lot of leadership and management development, however, also supporting people to be at their best even more of the time. I've been doing it now, gosh, we're coming up to almost 18, 19, 20 years of learning and development experience. And I do it because I love it. It's my passion. I have an unwavering belief in the potential of people. And I also have a real passion about making the most of human skills. So kindness, gratitude, compassion, curiosity, creativity. So to have an opportunity to do that all together, as I often say, I'm a very lucky girl.
You are, but you bring so much joy to everybody that you have a connection with. And to be honest, this podcast episode, yes, you will love it, listeners and viewers, but this is as much for me as it is for everybody else, because getting an opportunity to spend time with you is just wonderful. So thank you for being with us.
It's very good.
As you know, I love a bit of travel, and that's a big part of my world and what I probably spend thinking about more than I do leadership development. Probably that's not a good thing, but yes, I do. So share with us a little bit about where you love to travel. Where's your favourite holiday destination?
This is really interesting because I thought, I was like, I'm sure there'll be something travel orientated. I thought, let me have a think about it. And so I was very fortunate. I was brought up in the Middle East. So we lived in Bahrain for about 6 or 7 years, and then we moved to Hong Kong. My father was a pilot, and it was in the age of quite good staff travel rates as well, which meant as a young girl, oh my gosh, I was so lucky to have lived abroad, different cultures, but we used to get trips, to look at me saying, or relax, we'd pop to Sri Lanka, or we'd pop to Melbourne, or we'd pop here, because that was just the lifestyle that we'd had as expats, and so grateful for it. I'm not sure I appreciate it as much as I should then, but I certainly do now looking back. But what it means now is, having had that exposure and experience and living now in the UK, my favourite travel destination is either staying close to home or local, as in I really think that because I've had that opportunity, I'm now very much drawn to that feeling of being local. So my favourite place in the UK is Dorset. I love being by the sea. And I'm pretty certain, and I hope that one day I'll get to live by the sea, because I think that would be like an ultimate goal as well. But I am pretty happy being at home and sort of day trips and just experiencing some of the local destinations as opposed to being further afield.
Wonderful. I love that. And what an incredible experience to have growing up to have all those inputs. And I think that says that I can see maybe how that's impacted you actually in terms of how you live your life now. I think that's lovely.
Yeah, I am so grateful. I think living and experiencing different cultures from such a young age, but then experiencing it and just having that exposure just to different experiences, ways of doing things. And probably you're right, that sort of acceptance of people being individual, but also acceptance of different ways of doing things. And from an early age, it's not right and wrong. It's just different. There's just difference there as well. So yeah.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that. So your background, so you've been delivering in the leadership development and development space for a good while and having real positive impact. And you definitely have an impact on lots of people. That's how we met, through somebody else. So that's great. Tell us a little bit about your experience before that in terms of leading, and what leadership was like for you. What was your experience of leading?
Yeah, I think, and so I had a lot of opportunity. I was quite a steep trajectory into management and leadership, and I was working with teams of all sizes. So from small groups of sort of 5 to 10 within a team, up to business unit and leading a business unit of about 200, and that and everywhere is in between. And I think that range of experience taught me some really valuable lessons quite early on. I learned about the importance of humanness in leadership, being kind in leadership, admitting mistakes, listening more than I spoke, but I'm smiling because I'm still practicing that.
I love the chat, absolutely.
And as we know, we were chatting quite a lot before this. It's like,
Yes,
oh no.
we did. Yep.
And trusting, I think, really important as well, trusting the experience and exposure of others around me. And I very quickly began to understand that my role as a leader wasn't about doing stuff myself and having all of the answers, but it was about creating that environment, creating that experience, which is very much what we talk about now, which is creating an experience where other people could thrive, and helping to create a vision that others felt empowered to lean towards, where we can guide people through challenges, but we are creating an environment where they are enabled and empowered to deal with them themselves as well. So I think for me, leadership was around just taking a step back and getting the balance between the strategic long-term success of a team, a business, but also recognizing the importance of the everyday moments as well. And there's a little bit of a contradiction there. And I think that balance element of how can I be fully present here and now, making magical moments, but on the other side of it, creating that strategic longer term perspective, which I think as well is that sort of managing and leading and the difference between the two.
Definitely. Really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And what kind of industries have you worked in? What was your background, just so that the audience know a little bit more about that?
So across industries, so initially in banking, so working with one of the global banks, and then across lots of different business areas there. So retail, business, private banking, and otherwise. And then after that, very much going into across industries. So everything from retail, pharmaceutical, telecommunications, legal, professional services, you name it. But I think what's interesting is that once I realized my passion was people, well, yes, of course, people will always say, oh, it's different here. It's different in this industry. It's different in this country. It's different in this company. And there are, of course, naturally, I'm not saying there's not the nuances, but we're dealing with human beings. We're all human beings. So rather than thinking about the difference, let's think about what we have as humans that can help us to progress.
That commonness is so important, isn't it? In terms of, actually, as much as maybe we can't create a blueprint for leadership, actually there's a lot we can know about how to interact and connect with people. That's so important, isn't it? In terms of kind of boiling that down, that applies across the board.
So true. And I think, oh, I can't believe it's my first quote. Normally there's more than one quote. It's a quote. People know I love a quote. Brené Brown's quote on connection is everything, which she talks around. Connection is when people feel valued, seen, and heard, and they can give and receive without judgment. And for me, management, leadership, even when we're working with colleagues, if we can create an environment that we're feeling valued, seen, and heard, and we can give and receive without judgment, well, that for me is everything, which feeds into, so it is all about connection. I think we spent many moons talking about communication skills, which is important.
Yep.
For me, it's connection skills, because I can
Totally.
communicate, but am I actually connecting? And that's where the magic happens.
It's a massive difference, isn't it? And Brené Brown is just, just I adore her. And obviously, we're going to go on to talk about thriving as you progress into a more senior role. Her Dare to Lead book, like if you've got no budget for leadership development, at least buy them this book, or buy this book for yourself as a leader moving into this area, because the impact it had on me as somebody progressing through a development curve in leadership was just so important for me.
Absolutely. I think I'm a big fan as well of Brené Brown. I think that whilst, yes, she's quite populist in her theory, I think that the pragmatic nature of what she shares, I think, is really helpful. You just reminded me, actually, I just shared a book the other day with somebody. My first ever book around sort of development and leadership was Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, by Sue Jeffries. It's the title now. And it was interesting because it was a book that did send me on a particular path. And I think sometimes it's there's things and words that just resonate in a particular moment in time that I still stand by. And I felt really, really pleased to be able to pass that book on to someone else more recently now. I mean, it's probably quite outdated. It literally is 20 years since I read it, and some. However, I think we can get strength from other thoughts and ideas out there.
Definitely. So we're going to pull on your thoughts and ideas now as we move into this next part of the conversation. So we're going to be thinking about how we can help leaders thrive as they move into more senior roles. So what do you think they should be looking out for as they transition into those more senior roles?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I think for many of us in roles, whether it's as a personal leader or a leadership of others, that critical shift for me is moving from responsibility to accountability. So, as maybe a team leader or otherwise, we're responsible for a team's output and performance. And as we then step into middle and senior leadership, we become more accountable for the bigger picture, for the outcome, the strategic direction, the longer term success, the well-being of individuals and of the organization as well. And I think that transition often requires us to be able to also develop the skill of saying no and focusing on what truly matters. So yes, there's a lot out there around urgent and important. I enjoy Rory Varden's third dimension, which is what's significant. What's the significant stuff as well? So I think it's realizing that we're moving from leading in the business and the daily task, and we're leading of the business, leading really sort of broadly thinking that again, that strategic thinking, mentoring others, building a culture that aligns with organizational goals as well. For me, as I say, it's that shift from responsibility of a particular task or output into accountability for outcome.
I love that. And I think that word shift it has such impact here, and being open to the fact that what got you to that management role and maybe even to getting the promotion isn't what's going to take you into a place of success necessarily. You've built those foundations and the building blocks of skills, but you've now really got to kind of elevate that further into a place where, like you say, you're shifting from the doing to the thinking and enabling and empowering and creating a space for other people to be really successful, rather than it be about looking at you for the task or the work getting done, isn't it? It's such an
I think so.
important thing.
Yeah. And I think just as you were talking there is something that I think there's an additional layer on that. So sometimes people will meet me now and they'll hear about some of the roles I've done, or some of the experiences I've had, and more than one person has sometimes said, "Oh, I bet you're a bit different then," rather than my sort of lively slippers, quotes, and everything else. And my response is, no, I was exactly the same. So, and people might think, what are you talking about, slippers? So anybody that's met me face to face will know I live in my slippers. They're comfortable. I'll start in shoes, and then once I've made that first impression, I put my slippers on. But why, and again, time and place, of course, client facing or otherwise, I
Of
don't wear out
course.
my slippers. But just as a caveat, however, it was interesting that people almost thought that I would have acted differently. And
Yeah.
no, I remember vividly being on top floor in Canary Wharf and people going, "Oh gosh, Emma's here," because of a loud laughter. I was always being tutted at because I have quite a loud laugh. And the fun and the
Hmm.
singing songs, or I don't know what it is, but actually that's part of who I am. So it naturally was a part of my leadership. Now, of course, I recognize dialing up and dialing down, but it was second quote, Scott Stratton, and I love it, but which is, if you are your authentic self, you'll have no competition.
Yeah.
So there's that learning journey and greater experience and exposure around this side of leading of the business, whilst also bringing my uniqueness and my personality, and behavior breeds behavior. If I want others to be themselves as well, then I've got to be able to demonstrate that myself.
It's not about changing who you are, is it? It's about shifting your thinking
Yeah,
about how you deliver.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, completely.
absolutely.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Perfect. Lovely. So, what traps do you think people moving into more senior roles need to be aware of?
So I think there are many thought traps, I'm going to say, so
Mm.
thinking areas that might pop up. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is around our self-management. So being mindful of what are some of the things I'm telling myself, what are some of those thought patterns, the internal dialogue. As sometimes we step into some of those senior roles, it can be easy that we need to have the answers, or people expect us to have the answers, and that can lead to self-doubt, or maybe it might lead to a fear of showing our vulnerability. And
Yeah.
yet the key is to talk, to share, to learn from others. And I think when we open up, more often than not, it's like, oh yes, I get that. We were talking earlier on that a relatability of, we're sharing a thought pattern and somebody else is having that thought pattern. It normalizes it, it gets it out in the open. So I think seeking mentorship, coaching is invaluable, because whether it's formal or informal, because it allows us to really gain perspective and avoid getting too stuck in our heads. And I think that can only happen with one of the other big traps, which is not getting too involved in the weeds. So trying to do everything, or controlling details, or sticking with what we're comfortable. I really encourage people to challenge themselves. Why am I doing it? And at this level, delegation is not prioritization of tasks, as we know. It is about trusting, growing, letting people learn as well. So I think there is the thought traps. It's the not getting too stuck, being willing to delegate freely, recognizing that is an amazing tool to build trust as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
And and not knowing it all. So I think, embracing the fact that I don't know everything, surrounding myself with diverse perspectives and experiences, and staying really open to learning and
Yeah.
growing. I think they're all sort of things that, and I say as a leader, I think every day for most of us, they're things that we can watch out for.
Definitely. I love delegation bit. I think it's such a way to help you make those shifts and those transitions into those bigger roles. And it's so easy to get drawn into the, well, I know how to do this when you're in, especially with your, you've developed and you've gone through your specialism area. It's so easy to get sucked into that. But I was quite lucky when I moved into kind of my biggest role. I wasn't a subject matter expert in the areas I was leading, and it made my my transition into delegation a lot easier because I didn't have the answers on a lot of it. I had an opinion maybe, but there were people that were much more knowledgeable and skilled within my team. So that transition to delegating became a lot easier. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's interesting you said there is that when I'm working in industries that I haven't got that background or exposure, I'm almost forced to dial up my curiosity.
Yes.
And so lots of lovely open questions, and leaning into that as well. I think you're absolutely right. And I think the delegation thing as well is an interesting one. I think it says a lot more about us in our approach, which is, one, it's letting go, learning to let
Yeah.
go. Two, learning there's other ways out there of doing it. But three, for me, was around, I often was trying to be kind by keeping things back or not putting too much on. And
Yes.
again, it was a perspective which once was shared me, which is like, let me decide if I'm too busy. Let me decide if I can or can't do it rather than somebody else deciding for me. And that was just like, oh, wow, that's so interesting. The feedback that I've got along the way, and I think that some of the traps we have, we can go in ourselves, and yet by being open to feedback, I would say you can do two things with feedback. You either take it on board or put it in your back pocket.
Yeah.
It's fine, act on it, or just keep it for a rainy day, and then when maybe you get that feedback again, you might go, oh, maybe there's something in there as well. So why wouldn't we want to understand the impact that we're having?
Totally, I love that. So confidence. So hopefully somebody getting promoted, moving into a bigger role, maybe in a different organization, there's already a high, hopefully, of confidence of, I've got the job, brilliant. But also we want to maintain that then. We want to look after ourselves and our confidence as we start stepping into spaces that maybe we're not used to doing, and it's the new stuff. What's your tips, advice in terms of how people can really maintain or enhance that level of confidence?
Yeah, I think it's confidence is a tricky one because I think confidence in leadership is highly personal, as it's going to stem from our unique experiences as well. But I think you're right. I think there are some general approaches that can help. So a little bit, I know we often talk pick and mix, which is some of these things you might think it's not for me, but there's others that might be, and that's okay because it very much is from within. I think sometimes initially breaking down the larger stuff into smaller, more manageable steps helps us to not think that the path is quite so daunting. New role, we want to prove ourselves, want to do everything today. Actually, just being able to break it down can help. And I think I'm smiling. I am known for my to-do lists. I normally have about 10 to-do lists at any one time. So I realize the irony of sharing this, which is not getting too drawn up in the to-do list, but also shifting it to something I often will share with leaders is at the end of each week or even at the end of each day, write a done list. What have I done? What's my progress as well? But also on your to-do list, have some elements around to be. So actually, how have I shown up? So maybe I didn't get the stuff done, but I showed up with curiosity. I showed up with kindness. I think that's important. And another list, which is what's the stuff I'm not going to do? And let me tick that off as well. So actually, I'm not always going to just say yes. I am going to make sure that I've got some pauses in there. And I just think that those type of lists help us just to begin to measure our success in different ways. And I think something you mentioned earlier, we were chatting about around measure our success as well, maybe in the connections and relationships, not just outputs as well. So I think that's another, that the way we're measuring our success can be so much broader. I think constantly thinking, and what might I be missing? What are the different perspectives? And being kind to ourselves. There's an expression around, do you view your life with hindsight or kindsight? And so hindsight is, oh, what was I thinking? What was I doing? Almost beating ourselves up. Kindsight is, okay, what was I learning? What am I experiencing? And I think that helps us to recognize as well, we are always learning. And it's a little cliche or twee to say it, but a leader who thinks that actually, in fact, leaders who say, I'm confident and I'm not nervous about maybe something, they're the leaders that I'm normally a bit more worried about, rather than those leaders that say, yeah, but it's true that I'm a bit nervous or I'm a bit unsure here. For me,
Yeah.
that's the leader that actually is still open to feedback and learning and self-awareness as well.
Yeah, that self-awareness I think is really, really valuable. Like that continuing to learn, continuing to be open to ideas. I think how I kind of interpret what you were talking about there is, where's my impact? What impact have I had, rather than necessarily what goals or results or objectives have we completed this week? And as much as that is important because it shows progress and it shows momentum, and that's often what our boss is going to ask us about, not how were your brilliant conversations this week. It's how have we got on with that project? But as a leader for yourself and your own value, impact is so important, I think. And kind of those lists of, how have I built those connections this week? Am I doing the things that I think are important to nurture and develop this team? That is just bucket loads of that is really good. Yeah,
I agree, absolutely.
Lovely. So you touched on kindness a couple of times there. Talk to me about how important that is for leaders.
Oh, I feel as though I'm going to get on my soapbox now, but I don't make apology for it. I am passionate about kindness, whether it's in leadership or otherwise, and I think it's vital. I think it's underestimated around the power of it, and it's pretty cost effective, given that often it'll cost nothing. And I think kindness also is not just to others, it's also to ourselves as well. I think as leaders, as we've said, we're often our harshest critics. We push ourselves to be constantly on top of everything, but being gentle with ourselves, I think, is really important. So acknowledging we're human, we're capable of mistakes, learning to forgive ourselves, I think it sets the foundation then of how we interact with others and how we approach challenges in leadership. So I think there's the self-kindness bit, and then I think in the broader, leading with kindness is creating an environment which has got gratitude, respect, compassion, assuming positive intent in others, trusting that, you know what, people are showing up, they're doing their best, but just stuff happens and gets in the way. And it doesn't mean that we're shying away from holding people accountable or avoiding tough conversations. In fact, I believe that kindness involves having those courageous conversations, offering constructive feedback, positively challenging. I think there's a myth sometimes of, oh, but we might be too kind, and that could be seen as, I don't know, appearing weak or taken advantage of. But, you know, kindness isn't about being a pushover. It's about fairness, setting boundaries, expectations. I think ultimately kindness is about creating an environment where people thrive. And if we are modeling gratitude, compassion, we're encouraging those qualities in others, and that is going to promote healthier, happier people, not just professionally, but also personally as well. And I think it's a human trait and skill that is certainly not a soft skill. It is probably one of the most powerful things we've got available to us. And as I say, it's underrated about the impact that it can have.
Absolutely. And it's funny, isn't it? Because it's underrated. But if I think about the leaders, the managers that had most positive impact on me, one of the most important parts of that was that they were kind. I knew they cared about me. You know, those are the things that you like. That's the that's the value. You know, how do we turn those tummies around on a Sunday night so that actually we know we're going into an environment that is good for us? But that isn't about softness, is it? That isn't about letting people off easy. High expectation with massive amounts of support. You know, that's what it looks and feels like, because we want our teams to be amazing. We want them to achieve what they need to achieve and like get to those goals that they want to achieve for themselves. But you know what? We don't have to do that in an unkind way. It's really much easier and much nicer on ourselves.
Completely. And I think that's again, I think it's these two words are almost like, well, I'm either kind or I'm either challenging. It's either a celebratory conversation or it's a tough conversation over here. And I think getting a little bit more, these aren't polarized sort of perspectives, that I think some of the most challenging conversations I had as a leader were some of the kindest conversations. And as you mentioned there, individuals that have kept in contact to say they're so grateful for that uncomfortableness. At the time, it felt really difficult. I had all of those thought traps we were talking around in my head, at sometimes not having a huge amount of experience, but recognizing if I do it from a position of kindness, then that feels as though that's a good starting point. I think we're going off slightly on a tangent, but John Sills wrote a book around human experience, and there's something on there, if in doubt, be more human. And I think we can borrow that and we think about from a leadership perspective, which is, if I'm in doubt, what's the human response here?
Yeah,
because that
absolutely.
feels as though a pretty good starting point.
It's a pretty good start.
To go from.
It is. So again, what we can do is combine my recommendation for the book and Brené Brown in terms of leadership development input, but also like just be a normal human. Like it's there's a lot to be said for just reacting as a human rather than a robot for the organization. That's not what people connect with.
So true. And really interesting you just said there about not being a robot. One of the first bits of feedback I got with my first sort of, I'm going to say more senior role, there was about 60 or 70 people in the team. I went in full guns blazing in the fact of like all excited and um, lots of singing and dancing and the rest. Maybe not the dancing. And went into that experience. And after a couple of weeks, I started asking for feedback. And it was one of the most important pieces of feedback I think I received, which was a lady, said, yeah, Emma, people are really enjoying it. They like your style. Emma, people think you're a bit of a robot. And I was mortified. I thought, what do you mean? What do you mean I'm a robot? Like there's nothing robotic about me. But what the feedback was is that there was this constant strive for everything's okay, everything is positive. And whilst that is an important trait that I have and it's part of who I am, what I've recognized is because I wasn't sharing the light and dark, because I wasn't sharing some of the tougher days, because I wasn't sharing some of my vulnerabilities, I was creating a team or an environment around me with individuals who didn't feel that they could be themselves.
Yeah.
And I recognized that I can have these moments of high energy. I can also have moments of real vulnerability. I can have moments of really assertive, challenging conversations. And that's okay. In fact, that's much more human and realistic as well. So I thank that individual. And I made, thinking about that now, I think I'll drop them a message because I often use the story because it was so valuable. And that was, 20, 25 years ago that I had that feedback.
Really important, those moments, and they do stick with us because they're so valuable. So it's really important when people are also kind in that way and share that feedback, because that's what helps us be better as leaders, isn't it? If we don't get the feedback, but we also have to create an environment. So you'd obviously create the environment where they felt they were able to tell you. So that's great. So that probably ties in quite nicely with this last question around how do leaders, as they step into those bigger roles, avoid overwhelm? What would be your tips for making sure they don't fall into that trap of becoming overwhelmed with this new role?
I think some of it goes back to what we said earlier. So trying to catch and to challenge some of those less helpful thought traps. So, when I'm telling myself I can't do it, that's probably not the most helpful. So there's elements I might not be comfortable with. How can I reframe it?
Yeah.
What am I able to do? Really challenging ourselves so that we're speaking kind in a way that's kinder to ourselves. So I think that's the thought traps and catching those and sharing and talking about them. I also think something I talk about quite a lot is around it's about being a little bit more selfish. So taking time for yourself and putting yourself first isn't selfish, it's necessary. So we can't look after others if we're not looking after ourselves. So I think that catching our thought traps, making sure that you're looking after yourself and not feeling guilt associated with that as well. And I think finally, which probably is no surprises, but find fun and enjoyment in what we're doing as well. So taking time to connect with what makes our work meaningful, rewarding, what do we find enjoyable, whilst also allowing ourselves moments to pause and to appreciate those moments. So yes, joking a little bit around singing, but those that have worked with me over the last 25 years will know not that much of a joke. Love to have a little bit of a song, a little bit of a Mary Poppins. Why wouldn't you? In the middle of the day on the 37th floor of a corporate building. And again, it's time and place, but actually being myself, being my authentic self, challenging, but and also being really open to learning. So when we can't do something, we can't do it. I haven't experienced it before. Of course I can't do it, but it doesn't mean I'll never be able to do it. It's just that I can't do it yet. And I think that's sort of, again, the old Carol Dweck power of yet is really helpful. Being a bit gentle, a bit kinder to ourselves, but enjoying it along the way.
Totally. One of my kind of key things is looking at it from a perspective of if you don't love leading a team or the process of becoming a leader and being in that space, like question why you're doing it or find the routes to get to that point where you do enjoy it, because there's so much joy in having a positive impact on people's lives in a way that you cannot underestimate that you have as a leader. So if you're not enjoying it, my God, nobody else will be either. So
Oh, and I will often say, leadership, it's a responsibility and it's a privilege. I feel so grateful for the opportunities that I get to spend. And even nowadays, every interaction, it's a responsibility because I've got something there that I'm doing and I want to make sure people extract value. On the other side, it's a privilege to be able to talk, to share, to learn, to connect as well. And I think that if you lose that element, then I think it can be found, but it's taking time to look at what can I do. And again, those baby steps. It's not always going to be roses, but looking for those moments of the green shoots coming through is important.
Emma, thank you so much. I could have definitely carried on talking about this all day, and I'm sure we will do at some point. I think we kind of decided we're going to have just a ramble conversation recorded one day, aren't we? So I'm looking forward to that one. Emma, where can people find you?
Oh, so I am probably the best place is LinkedIn. You'll find me. I love to write. I share different thoughts and ideas, usually around the themes that we've spoken around today. So kindness, but also sometimes some of those thought traps. So I try to write about them so that to be open so that we can start more of a conversation. So, I sometimes think if I'm feeling it, maybe somebody out there has got some thoughts or ideas around it as well. So probably on LinkedIn or on our webpage, reppel.co.uk. And I'm always delighted to have conversations as we're having today. So delighted for any new connections.
Wonderful. Very much worth a follow. Always really lovely ideas and thoughts shared. So thank you so much for doing that. And I'd, definitely follow Emma. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining this episode of the Purple Sky Thinking for Leaders podcast. You'll find all the resources and the links that we mentioned down in the show notes. If you love this episode, why not share it with somebody else in a leadership role who you think would find this useful? If you haven't already, I'd love for you to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And if we've earned it, why not leave us a 5-star review? I'm Anwen, your host, and I look forward to welcoming you back to the Purple Sky Thinking for Leaders podcast very soon. Bye for now.